Hello, good morning, and welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's. My name is Anne McElvoy of Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. It's Monday, March the 24th, 2025. 2 days before Rachel Reeves' spring statement. 9 days before Donald Trump reveals whether the UK is or isn't going to be included in a new round of tariffs. And the week is also the one where Germany gets a new chancellor and a new government, which is where Anne is speaking to me from this morning in what looks like a hotel room. Anne, where are you and what are you doing?
So I am back in a not terribly glamorous hotel, but a nice place in the heart of Berlin near the Bundestag, because the German parliament is preparing to meet tomorrow. 17 working groups in the coalition talks have to do their first round results by the end of today. Friedrich Merz's Christian Democrats are, of course, the biggest party in the coalition. The Social Democrats join it too. The new parliament will sort of confirm that is the deal tomorrow. It's called a GroKo, or a Grand Coalition, though Merz has let it be known he doesn't want it to be called that because he brought most of the votes to it, Sam. So he wants it to be called the New Beginning Coalition, which I'm not sure has much of a ring to it. Poor Friedrich Merz, he's been waiting for years to become Chancellor, but because these talks, now that big bit has gone through on getting rid of the debt brake for more spending, the talks have kind of run into sand, and they're going to take quite a long time, we hear. So he will sit in the Bundestag as party leader, and he won't become Chancellor, according to my colleague who heads up Politico in Berlin. Maybe, he says, at the end of April, probably in May. So he sits as a party leader, but not as Chancellor, so he's still waiting, really.
Right, let's look at what's coming up in the UK this week. On Monday, our Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander are doing an event on potholes. They're telling councils to prove that they are tackling potholes or face losing out on cash to fix them. What they've actually got to do is put a whole load of information on their own websites about how many potholes are being filled, what percentage of the roads are in what kind of condition. They've got to do that by the summer or lose the cash. So will that work? I seem to remember most Prime Ministers in my lifetime doing pothole events, but there are still big holes outside my house. On Monday, talks resume in Saudi Arabia about peace in Ukraine, and Reform reveals its candidate in the Runcorn by-election.
And on Tuesday, there will be more pitch rolling for the spring statement from Rachel Reeves. On Wednesday, she gives that statement after 2.5 months of build-up, straight after Prime Minister's questions. Also, that's the day we get the impact assessment for the changes to welfare and benefits, and we find out how they really shake down. On Thursday, Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds will be addressing Chatham House Global Trade Conference, and that has huge significance given that Donald Trump is set to announce yet more global tariffs. Reynolds is at the forefront of trying to soften or stop them hitting Britain hard.
He came back from the US last week. We'll talk about more of that in a moment. On Friday, Reform UK launches its election campaign. But look, going through the week ahead, and it's pretty clear that it'll be dominated by one event and one person. Chancellor Rachel Reeves takes centre stage with her spring statement.
And over the weekend, she confirmed plans to cut civil service running costs by 15%. Papers now starting to report things this morning that are immediately at risk from those budget cuts, including perhaps universal free school meals for the youngest school children. The Times is citing that as something that might be on the table. Rachel Reeves, however, is holding the line. It is not a return to austerity. She's justifying all of this. She argues, we're going to hear this phrase repeatedly this week, the world has changed. Sam, you've got a pretty good handle, I think, of what's coming on Wednesday, so why don't you give us an early rundown?
Originally, the whole thing was meant to be little more than a formality. An update, I think, was the original language of the Treasury. The moment where she is required by law to present to Parliament, effectively, her independent watchdog marking her economic homework, or in the jargon, the Office for Budget Responsibility, publishing its economic and financial outlook, which it's required to do twice a year. But what changed is since the last time that happened, she ended up in a much more complicated economic picture. This has ballooned into a massive and very difficult moment for the Chancellor, because that OBR assessment now puts her on course to break the foundational promise of her Chancellorship, her fiscal rules. And so on Wednesday, she's going to reveal what kind of corrective action she's taking. And such is this statement, it sort of evolved, that one measure of success in number 10, I believe, is how quickly we stop talking about it. There are announcements that might sort of bleed Thursday into Friday to sort of try and put this in a growth context. But really, I think number 10 don't want them ever to be used, and everyone to stop talking about Wednesday's statement as quickly as possible.
Yes, well, good luck with that one, because I think this spring statement is now going so close to being a budget. It's interesting how many politicians are sort of telling us not to use words about things, that I can't see something of this scale not being talked about for a very long time to come. And if so, I mean, this is a bit of a bet in advance, Sam, but what do you think we will be talking about most?
Well, as we've been saying kind of for 2.5 months, and the overall picture for this, by the way, for all the talk of the world has changed, has not changed since I did my first presentation on this, my first kind of screen on this for Sky News on January the 7th, that the basic building blocks of what's about to happen have not changed. Everything flows from the fact that she set herself incredibly tight limits on borrowing, basically copying those from the Conservatives, which is to say that she has promised that by 2029, so in 4 years' time, all day-to-day government spending must be funded by taxes, not borrowing, something that we haven't really achieved in 30 years. So a massive promise to reduce borrowing for a certain part of government operations. Now, back in the budget in October, she was on track to do this, but only just. She was only going to hit that promise to reduce borrowing by the narrowest of margins, about 10 billion quid. Now, since then, almost immediately since then, the economy hasn't grown, borrowing costs have gone up, and she's on course to lose that so-called headroom, that buffer. So she's got to take action. So let me just run you through specifics, right? The OBR are going to say that growth has basically halved. In October, the OBR thought it was 2% in 2025. I think that's going to be around about 1% now. Borrowing is going to be up. Inflation is going to be 0.4% higher than at the start of the year. So those are the reasons why basically we're going to have to borrow more, and the 10 billion will have been wiped out. So she's got to find 10 billion pounds for certain types of government operations. She's got to save 10 billion pounds in that 2029 budget in order to get back on track. Right, 5 of the 10 are going to come from welfare savings, although exactly how we find out on Wednesday. 2 billion will be done by what she calls efficiencies, but really that what she'll do in reality is reduce the amount of money she says she's going to have to divide up between departments. The sort of amount, what's known as the envelope, the overall spend on government departments from 2026 onwards. Now, whether that ends up being efficiencies or actually ends up being some frontline cuts, well, that's what we're going to find out in the run up to the spending review in June. And then the final way, so that's at least 2 billion from that. And then the final way that she'll get to 10 is a little bit of an accounting trick. I think the FT were onto it over the weekend, but I think we even discussed this on the podcast. And it's an accounting trick that flows from the fact that when the Prime Minister decided to reduce the aid budget and increase the defence budget, well, a lot of the aid budget is day-to-day spending, but a lot of the defence budget is what's known as capital spending, big shiny projects. Now, Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules exclude capital spending. So if you move money from the aid budget to the defence budget, suddenly that doesn't count against her fiscal rules and gives her probably about £2 billion more wiggle room. Now, the government insists that wasn't why they did the defence spending announcement in the way they did, but serendipitously, it has massively, massively helped Rachel Reeves by that being the case. And then the final thing that's coming on Wednesday, and we mentioned this earlier on, but actually this could end up being the biggest story of the week. We find out so much more detail on the welfare spending changes. Now, last week, Liz Kendall gave us a sort of preview of them in the Commons, but a lot of people have ended up speculating and being unable to put numbers on them because we didn't have any numbers. That changes on Wednesday. You could almost say they're being buried beneath the spring statement, but I think they will be the focus of a lot of attention. And all of this happening because growth isn't what it was meant to be. How much should we believe that? How much sympathy should we have for Rachel Reeves?
To an extent, the world has changed. The mantra that I'm pretty sure we're going to hear a lot of from the Chancellor is true, but the world has been changing for a while, and it's all been going in the direction of limiting growth and cutting out headroom for governments, and particularly governments in Europe. So to an extent, I think we can be sympathetic that the backdrop, sympathetic for all of us. It's us we feel sorry for on this podcast. People should feel sorry for a government having to operate when you have an American president who looks like he's going to go even harder and faster on tariffs than was originally threatened, when it's a very uncertain and shaky prospect of an end to the war in Ukraine. And even the terms of that are adding so much, as you've just pointed out there, that need to amp up defence spending, and then chancellors trying their best and the Treasury trying their best for it not to impact too much on day-to-day spending in other areas. So all of that is true. But of course, you do come back to the fact that Rachel Reeves set this very tight spending corset and rules for herself. And that is where the criticism is coming from. I'm hearing it from backbenchers, even from loyal ministers. They do say, well, this is what Rachel Reeves wanted to do to show that Labour was fiscally responsible. So, of course, when you bump your head then up against that very low ceiling, and then you say, well, actually, it feels even lower than it was because the world has changed. Some of that, perhaps, you could have argued, and I think Jeremy Hunt did in a rather interesting piece that he wrote as the previous Tory Chancellor, that you just do have to give yourself some leeway, but you have to grow your way towards it, he would say, rather than borrowing or taxing. And that still feels like it's a bit of an unresolved question hanging over the spring statement. I don't know what you make of that.
Well, there definitely won't be any tax rises. There definitely won't be any tax rises in the spending review. But when we come to the budget at the end of the year, well, will Rachel Reeves be able to keep her promise that there are not going to be any big hikes in taxes? That's what she promised after the last budget. Can she still do that? There are lots of doubters. Either her tax promises go or her borrowing rules.
Exactly. So that was precisely what I meant. Just in case you thought I hadn't been reading Politico or watching Sky News, yes, I wasn't expecting a tax bombshell in the spring statement. But I do think, and I will sort of stick to this, so sometimes if you nag away at something, occasionally you turn out to be right, that it will start that conversation running, given that we're going to see those pretty awful projections consolidated this week. We've got OBR, OECD, none of them are particularly good for Rachel Reeves in the UK. Does this argument return? It certainly is from certain backbenchers, if you won't want to listen to, but just saying, well, you've made some changes on other things. If the world has changed, maybe that's your excuse to start talking about taxing the rich more. And I do think that is going to be a drumbeat.
As ever, we get a complicated split screen dimension to our politics today, right? This week, one of the big things that's going to happen, I think, is greater detail on the welfare changes, because we didn't have very much from Liz Kendall. And into the void, quite a lot of scary figures have been started to be bandied around. So the FT did an analysis of what they think might be the consequences of Liz Kendall's announcement. And they said that some people in line at the moment for personal independence payments, some people who receive a total of £15,000 a year, excluding housing support, will, after these changes, get just £5,400. So 15,000 income down to 5,000. That's a hell of a drop, Anne. Now, we will find out whether or not that kind of figures on the money on Wednesday in the impact assessment released by the Department for Work and Pensions, so we can work out how much of these cuts fall on things like PIP and the reassessment and how much that's meant to generate. But this week, that will give greater urgency to the do we have to do the welfare changes conversation. Meanwhile, there's another massive conversation that seems to me to be absolutely horrifically inconveniently timed for this government, which is that Rachel Reeves confirmed yesterday that, and Peter Mandelson said it on the record on Saturday, that this government is looking at scrapping, i.e. giving a tax break to some of the biggest internet companies, social media companies in the world. Our friends at Meta and Google and Amazon could all benefit if this government decides to scrap the digital services tax, which is a demand of Donald Trump's ahead of his threat to impose tariffs all around the world on April the 2nd. We're looking at trying to protect the UK from that. One of the ways that we're doing it might be to offer up this tax as a sacrifice in order to try and carve out some kind of special deal for the UK to avoid absolutely swinging and economically damaging tariffs being levied on imports from into America from the UK. But that means that on the one hand, you're cutting $5 billion from welfare for the poorest and most disabled people. And on the other, you are giving a tax break to some of the largest profit-driven companies in the world. And I think the clash of those two things will be horrific for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And my sense is that the sort of clash of those two things, that the political impact of that hasn't really begun to dawn on this government.
Yes, that's right. You've got flat rate tax there, 2%. Global revenues, you have to have in excess of 500 million on revenues, in this case derived from the UK. That gives you a sense, doesn't it, that you are really dealing here with the very big pike perch in the tech pond. I guess that the answer from officials, certainly who are working on this deal at the behest of the Prime Minister, is that this deal is really about cooperation, and when you do something like that, you have to sort of give and take. So it's going to be sold, Sam, I think, as this is part of a great opportunity for the UK tech sector. Of course, the background is fully clear, and who has the bargaining power is also pretty clear too, and the mindset of the American administration to boot. So I think because it doesn't look good at all, and it also, I've noticed how many things Labour were going to talk about in terms of tech companies, their activities, their ethics, etc., have rather quietly disappeared from the conversation in government in the last weeks while these talks were ongoing. The best thing that they can do with it is probably declare that this is a jobs opportunity and will make Britain into a great tech capital. But how many people, shall we say, outside Silicon Roundabout are going to see it that way, as you point out?
The whole reason that Donald Trump is backing the tech firms is because he thinks it's an investment in America. So quite how the government can then twist this as being a big boost for UK jobs and the UK economy, I think it's a tricky one. Can I just chip in
why you can, maybe? Sorry, I feel it's my job today. I've ended up defending the government today. I think because their dealings in terms of legislation around digital services is so much worse with the EU, right? So it's a bit of a case of, yes, you're going to give up an awful lot, bring a lot to the table to get this done in the UK. But given the fact that there is such hostility, and it is very much channeled through different approaches to tech regulation in Europe, the argument from the UK will be we will still get more out of this in the end, because in a way, by racing to it, we've got that deal done. And there is that sacrifice that we've just talked about and how that's going to play out politically. But there is a real standoff, and one that doesn't look like it's going to come to an end with the EU and the US over tech and tech regulation.
Well, let's see what side of the debate we come down to. But when it comes to priorities, it does feel like Labour MPs are getting more and more sense of where the government is prepared to give way and where it isn't. I was in communication with one Labour MP yesterday. He just made the point, one of Rachel Reeves' big themes this week is you can't have U-turns, because they've all been pressing for U-turns on welfare and the winter fuel payments and all of that. And they are told in all these number 10 strategy sessions that U-turns make a government look weak. To which one MP replied, I fully understand that, but I keep hearing you U-turned on nom-doms. And that's the issue, right? There are things that this government has changed its view on, nom-doms, the definition of debt, even how it treats capital spending. And so it does U-turn, but it doesn't U-turn on the things that it doesn't want to, and it does pick and choose, and that kind of thing has aggravated some Labour MPs who they need to keep on side because the government doesn't want things like this week's spring statement to land badly. You heard the alarm, Anne. That means we've got to wrap up. There's a huge amount going on this week, so we've only just kept buttons popping within the straitjacket of our 20 minutes. But we'll be back tomorrow, Tuesday morning, for the last 24-hour countdown before the spring statement.
And guarantee, cast iron, there will be more politics tomorrow. See you then.
Bye-bye.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.